I'd like to start off by saying, bear with me. My voice is still recovering from a cold that my daughter gave me last week. So if I have to stop to cough or take a sip of water, just bear with me. So as Dr. Lansdowne mentioned, today we'll be talking about the environmental toll in our orthopedic operating rooms. So I have no relevant disclosures or no disclosures at all. And I wanted to start off by talking about the inspiration for this discussion this morning. It comes from a recent trip down to Florida to visit some family. And while down there, we went on a fishing trip in the Gulf of Mexico. While offshore, we stumbled upon a weed line, which is basically a floating mat of seaweed. And I'm guessing that most people don't realize how amazing this is to stumble into in the middle of the ocean, because it usually means there's a ton of fish around. As we idled closer, slowly to avoid scaring off any fish that might be on the seaweed, my excitement pretty instantly vanished when I saw literally hundreds of face masks tangled in this mat of seaweed in the middle of the ocean. To make things worse, not only were they tangled in the seaweed, but there were hundreds more masks floating around it, waiting to become entangled. There were so many masks in the water that we didn't even bother throwing in any lines because it would be an instant tangle. So we quickly left, went on to our planned fishing grounds, and ended up having a great day. But the image of that mass of floating mass tangled in the seaweed is really going to stay with me forever. And it showed me that what we do in medicine has an impact that extends far beyond the confines of the actual hospital in which we work. So with that as kind of the inspiration, an outline for today's talk is going to be to first define operating room waste, and specifically waste in the orthopedic operating room. We're next going to talk about how we can objectively quantify waste. We're going to talk about specific pain points of waste in our ORs in general, and then also in orthopedics. Then we'll move on to potential solutions, future directions, and then celebrate some of our recent successes. So waste is not new in the operating room. We know that the operating room results in the production of a variety of waste byproducts that can be classified as follows. There's municipal and domestic solid waste, which are essentially just regular trash. There's hazardous or red bag waste. There's fluid waste, which is typically or often a subset of this biohazardous waste. There's sharps that need to be disposed of in the operating room. There's cytotoxic waste, which is dangerous to cells. And then there's also recyclable trash or recyclable waste that's produced in addition to the textiles needed for both the surgeons and the patients in the operating room. And finally, there's a particularly difficult subset of waste to deal with, which is black box waste. This is a type of waste that's both hazardous and cytotoxic and particularly difficult to deal with. However, to simplify things for this morning, we're going to group all of these different subcategories of waste into three main groups. There's standard trash, there's overall energy consumption, and then we'll also talk about red bag or biohazardous waste. So it's not a new phenomenon that our operating rooms generate an incredible amount of waste. However, it wasn't until the early 2000s that people really began to take note of the sheer volume of the trash that we generate. It was found that an OR can be responsible for generating over half of a hospital's solid waste, despite only representing a minuscule percentage of the patient care areas that go on within a healthcare system. That percentage stands out when we estimate that hospitals in the US generate 1.8 million kilograms of waste per year, again, just in the United States. I want to reiterate that. That's over 4 million pounds of trash annually just in this country, just from hospitals. And waste audits performed in hip arthroscopy show that the average hip scope produces about 9.4 kilograms of waste per case, while more equipment-intensive procedures like a total knee generate, on average, 13.3 kilograms of trash per case. That's over 26 pounds of waste for every primary knee on average. This doesn't even take into account the more equipment-intensive revisions that we do often here. And so if we take that waste generated by a single primary total knee and extrapolate that to the projected number or need for primary total arthroplasty going forward, just in this country, it's clear that we're currently on an unsustainable trajectory. And so to make matters worse, not all waste is solid waste. The United States is one of the top 3 greenhouse gas producing countries, along with China and then the European Union when looked at as a whole. Healthcare as an industry is a major contributor to the greenhouse gas emissions and accounts for up to 10% of total emissions in our country. In fact, our healthcare system here in the US is such a powerful producer of greenhouse gases that is responsible for nearly a quarter of all global healthcare-related emissions, and our healthcare industry outproduces all but 12 countries in the world in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, despite only representing 4% of the world's population. So again, just healthcare, just in the US, produces more greenhouse gas than every country in the world but 12. It's pretty significant. Operating rooms across all specialties have been identified as a key contributor to this greenhouse gas emissions due to the combination of high energy use and significant solid and liquid waste generation. So while this is pretty alarming, there are some bright spots, and we'll talk more about them later. But the first is that recognition is starting to happen, and it's happening across medical specialties. The awareness of this waste production has increased over time, and as you can see from the graph shown here, the absolute number of studies published per year when operating room waste is typed into the PubMed database has been increasing. It remained pretty steady state when it first showed up around the 70s, and then you can see at the early 2000s, you get that little uptick, but it really wasn't until the late 2010s and now early 2020s that we see that exponential growth. So people are starting to pay attention. So before we move on to talk about the pain points, we need to first understand how to objectively quantify the waste we generate in the operating room. This brings us to understanding what a life cycle analysis is. A life cycle analysis, or an LCA, is a complex and time-intensive study that allows researchers to objectively quantify the environmental impact of a product or a service, and it utilizes both the resources required and the pollutants produced from that specific process or procedure. This type of analysis is not unique to the healthcare sector and has been used across a number of industries, from studying the impacts of the fossil fuel industry, agricultural industry, food science, as well as many others. LCAs are also certainly not new to medicine and have been used across nearly all subspecialties of medicine, both surgical and non-surgical. The output of these studies is typically measured in units of carbon dioxide equivalents, or CO2 EQs. This is kind of the estimated greenhouse gas emission for a product or a service. These studies, while extremely time-intensive and labor-intensive, are excellently suited to objectively quantifying the environmental impact of a surgical procedure. And I like to argue that they're particularly relevant in orthopedics because not only can it be used to understand a surgical procedure, but it can provide a very detailed and nuanced approach at understanding the environmental impact of an implant or a device as well. So this is an example flow diagram that shows a process when thinking about creating a life cycle assessment to evaluate the carbon footprint of a surgical procedure. As you can see, this is a pretty exhaustive analysis and goes as far as to take into account the manufacturing of raw materials used for the production of an implant or any of the materials needed to complete a surgical procedure. Because of this seemingly infinite scope, it's extremely important to first define a clear starting and stopping point when conducting these kinds of analyses. So the one shown here is what's called a true cradle-to-grave life cycle analysis. And what that means is we start by looking, and if you can look at the left side of the screen, you'll see the raw material extraction and processing that's required to both power the operating room. This is in terms of electrical use, concerning HVAC, which is essentially ventilation and air conditioning heating, the lighting for the operating room, and then the machines, both anesthetic and operative. It also looks at the fossil fuels required to power the HVAC and also produce hot water for the operating room. Then it can also look at the raw materials needed to manufacture, produce, and even distribute all surgical instruments, any disposable equipment that's used in the operating room, medications administered, the linens that are used, again, both by surgeons and patients, and then the cleaning supplies needed to turn over the operating room. So again, pretty exhaustive type of analysis, but very nuanced and very detailed. And sadly, orthopedics is lagging behind the rest of medicine when it comes to quantifying the waste we produce with these LCAs. This chart shows a list of all life cycle analyses published as of 2023, and it's listed by specialty. And as you can see, ortho is tied for dead last with a grand total of 2 truly prospective life cycle analysis studies. I'd like to point out neither of which were performed here in the US. And since there's only 2, I figured we could take some time to go over them to see what they show. So this is the first one we'll talk about. This is the German study that investigated how a disposable system and a reusable instrument set for single-level lumbar fusion surgeries contribute to the environmental impact and to see which system is actually more advantageous from an environmental standpoint. The disposable trays were all modular, and each component was individually opened as needed during the surgery, whereas the larger reusable sets had every instrument opened right from the start of the case, as we typically do in our procedures. A true cradle-to-grave life cycle analysis was performed to evaluate this entire life cycle of both sets of instruments, from raw material extraction, production, transportation of the instruments, and then up to final disposal or reprocessing. So counterintuitively, the disposable trays actually had a significantly lower environmental impact than that of the standard reusable trays. That's how little we focus on the environmental impact with our current practices. It's actually more beneficial to rely on the landfill than it is to turn over our excessive sets and reprocess them. And as we mentioned earlier, these LCAs are specifically useful in orthopedics because they can be employed to perform an extremely focused analysis of a specific implant and look at the carbon footprint associated with its production. So this is an Irish study that explored whether additive manufacturing, this is basically a 3D printing model, is more environmentally friendly than conventional manufacturing, which is essentially just a milling process for the production of medical implants. And in this case, it was a specific femoral component for a primary total knee made out of a titanium alloy. Again, a true cradle-to-grave life cycle analysis was employed, and the manufacturing methods with a focus on primary energy consumption and CO2 emissions was performed. And when we consider the entire life cycle, it was found that the additive or 3D printing style of manufacturing actually appears to have an edge over the traditional milling. This is likely due to the fact that the traditional milling generates a lot of waste, especially when it comes to complex geometric designs. It's very efficient when it's a simple geometric shape, but a femoral component has a lot of smooth surfaces, a lot of curvature. And when you take that big block and you start whittling away at it, all that wasted titanium ends up just going in the trash. And while there's more upfront cost associated with this 3D printing style of manufacturing, it could have a potential long-term benefit for our environment. And so when we look at how we quantify waste in the operating room, I think it'd be incomplete unless we briefly talked about what a waste audit is. So this is a type of analysis, and while less intensive and comprehensive than an LCA, still provides some objective data that's useful to surgeons, nurses, and administrators when making their perioperative equipment decision-making. Typically, these studies have a main output of the mass of total recyclable and non-recyclable waste. And these types of audits represent the already anemic body of literature that evaluates the orthopedic impact in the operating room, the environmental impact in the orthopedic operating room. And so not surprisingly, the amount of waste produced within orthopedic subspecialties varies pretty significantly. The graph shown here is from a Canadian study that did a waste audit at a single institution and found that arthroplasty procedures resulted in the highest volume of non-recyclable trash. This was followed by sports and trauma cases, and it was closely followed by upper extremity, foot and ankle, and then pediatrics had the lowest volume of non-recyclable waste generated. I'd like to point out that spine surgery is notably missing from this graph because they did not have a service at this hospital, but other studies have indicated that spine tends to be a higher producer of waste in the operating room and would probably fall more towards the arthroplasty side of this graph. So now that we have a baseline understanding for how operative waste can be objectively studied and quantified, let's start examining some areas of concern within our own operating rooms and specifically within orthopedics. So this is a nighttime photo of our Mission Bay campus, and it represents nothing new, but something that's profoundly resistant to change. You can see here that virtually every light in the hospital remains on 24/7, 365, irrespective of the time of day or the traffic that specific wing sees. Again, it's not surprising that hospitals utilize massive amounts of energy. They have to be staffed around the clock. They often have to be prepared to react at a moment's notice. And because of this unique set of circumstances, they can't just be shut down like a typical office building during these low use periods. It's also known that an average size hospital consumes 5 times as much energy as that of the average American household. And I don't think any of the hospitals we work at would be characterized as average size. Additionally, operating rooms are responsible for consuming 3 to 6 times more energy than any other region or area in the hospital. And again, only represent a minuscule portion of the total area of care that takes place within a hospital system. So next, let's focus on the biohazardous trash that we mentioned earlier. Well, we've already highlighted that solid waste is a main contributor to the overall waste production in the operating room. Red bag waste, or the disposal of biohazardous materials, is particularly difficult and troublesome. Biohazardous waste is a federally defined and regulated entity as any waste product containing recognizable human blood, body fluids, or infectious materials. This can include gauze, dressings, and any other products that are, quote, noticeably contaminated with such fluids and thereby potentially harmful to human contact. I'd like to point out the subjective nature of this definition. There's no number or metric that we can use. It's just anything that's recognizable or noticeably contaminated. And we'll get back to that going on in this talk. This is important because different types of waste that we produce are handled differently. The red bag waste that we produce is particularly energy intensive to dispose of because it requires first sterilization by an autoclave, usually at a different site, so it requires transportation, energy used to then autoclave it, and then it's typically transported to a different site for ultimate incineration. So all of these steps, and especially the incineration at the end, generates substantial greenhouse gases. Whereas in contrast, trash taken directly to the landfill, skipping all of these environmentally unfriendly steps, is sadly the lesser of the two evils and has a lower impact on the environment as a whole. Additionally, adding improperly sorted trash into red bag containers adds a preventable environmental burden that we can certainly do better on. So ultimately, we have a decision to make while in the operating room that results in significantly different handling of the trash that we create. Next, let's move on to liquid waste. So again, this is oftentimes a subset of biohazardous waste, but it's even more difficult to deal with usually. We all know there's nothing more frustrating than when intraoperatively your suction goes down, but as soon as that fluid hits the canister and you can begin to focus on the case again, you pretty much forget that liquid waste ever even existed. But this fluid waste typically requires conversion into solid waste, and that requires the use of chemical solidifiers. Now, this newly formed solid waste is then discarded as red bag waste, which then goes on to subsequent incineration. Sustainability efforts should focus on the reduction of incinerated materials, and specifically this type of fluid waste, because of the greenhouse gases associated with it. But it's also incredibly relevant for fluid waste because this type of waste is a leading cause of atmospheric dioxin and mercury emissions here in the US. And when it comes to sterile processing, we can definitely do better. Within orthopedics, we already know that our instrument sets tend to be large and with many items often going unused. I think it's safe to say that we've all been in a situation where intraoperatively a specific instrument's missing, something gets dropped, we all kind of freak out, and then we immediately call for a bunch of sets to be brought up from SPD so that we can open them and then find one tool that we need while the rest just sit on the back table. This all adds to OR overage. which is defined as any instrument that's prepared for surgery and ultimately not used. So this not only leads to clutter on the back table, which is important because it can lead to potential contamination, but it also leads to both significant electrical and water use when sent back to SPD for reprocessing. So now that we realize all the things that we do really poorly, let's talk about some steps we can take towards fixing them. So obviously, waste in our operating rooms is a huge problem. I don't expect that after today's short talk, this issue will be resolved. But what I do hope is that I can give some bite-sized suggestions on how we can do better. And while they may seem small or insignificant, if we as a department are able to make consistent behavioral changes, I think this can be at least an effective first step in mitigating some of the mess that we're ultimately responsible for. And we can do so without sacrificing on patient care or safety. So we'll start by going back through each of the pain points, and then we'll discuss some other ways in which we can improve. And so looking at the Mission Bay campus lit up at night, it'd be easy to say, let's just turn off all the lights in the hospital. But we all know that's both unrealistic and unsafe. However, there are still areas that we can focus on to find energy savings. And we all know that not every operating room is used all night, every night. So this brings us to the concept of OR setback. OR setback refers to a time schedule for reduced energy use through minimal OR HVAC function during low use periods in an operating room. These reductions can be set to a specific schedule or timer and can be unique to each operating room within a hospital. And they can also be manually overwritten if and when necessary. There's even a published model on how to do this out of Taiwan back in 2012. Wang et al. Described a system in which OR HVAC inflow was reduced by 45% while still maintaining an operating room temperature of 71 degrees and a relative humidity of 45%. This allowed for the optimal balance between maintaining OR readiness while still realizing some energy savings and not sacrificing on any patient safety concerns. Similarly, a Spanish study performed in 2020 used a similar strategy in just 2 of their operating rooms for just a period of a few months. They found that this saved 2% on their total electrical output for the hospital annually. So that's just 2 ORs for a few months. So alterations in HVAC have been proven to be effective in reducing energy and waste in the OR, but also may not be feasible in every hospital, every operating room. So there's still some low-hanging fruit that we can use to make a difference. Just turn off the lights in the operating room. So I don't know if this happened to you guys, but turns out my dad wasn't just hounding me for leaving the lights on as a kid for no reason. It actually makes a difference. By implementing a timer or a schedule for cycles of lights on and off during these low-use periods, significant savings of both electricity, energy, and money can actually be realized. A single hospital in Washington employed these timers for turning off the lights in the operating room automatically in just 2 of their ORs, which reduced their total electrical output by 25,000 kilowatts. It also resulted in the savings of $4,000 annually per operating room that this was employed, which is particularly useful when talking to administrators about potential changes. Similarly, Carolinas Medical Center also participated in a power down initiative where all operating room lights and anesthesia equipment were turned off overnight when not in use. And this was a very deliberate thing that was done at the end of each day. This resulted in massive savings of both energy and money, with $33,000 saved annually, and then a massive amount of reduced CO2 emissions at nearly 250 metric tons of CO2 or greenhouse gas emissions prevented. And so everyone knows that when we work at SFGH, we've made some steps in the right direction when a room goes green. For those that aren't there or haven't been to the new hospital, this refers to a state of reduced green-colored lighting that's utilized in the ORs overnight that are immediately ready to be activated for an emergency case. This is typically a backup room 1 or a backup crane room. And so while this is a step in the right direction, we certainly don't standardize this across our healthcare system, and there's still work that can be done to improve. Next, let's revisit our biohazardous trash problem. So this is a picture I took from this block at our county hospital. And this is a pretty common sight in our operating rooms where the biohazardous bags pretty much on a 3-to-1 ratio, outnumber our regular trash containers. I also know that I'm certainly guilty of this, but I've definitely thrown away items in the biohazardous container simply because it was the closest trash vessel to where I was standing at that moment. However, that's an easy area where we can improve. So all we have to do is change our habits and sort our biohazardous waste appropriately. One study found that up to 90% of the red bag waste or biohazardous waste from the OR was found to be unnecessarily sent for biohazardous and ultimately incineration disposal, and could have instead been just been placed in the conventional trash. Given that we now understand the high cost and environmental burden of the handling of this red bag waste, again, the lesser of the two evils is actually just to put it in the regular trash. In addition to just taking a few steps to the proper trash container, we can reduce the size and number of biohazardous bags placed within the operating room to prevent possible or inappropriate sorting of regular trash into the red bag waste containers. So here's a list of common items that are typically improperly sorted into the biohazardous waste bins. And I wanted to draw your attention to these 4 because prior to researching for this talk, I would have thought that these would have been correctly placed in a biohazardous container. And so again, remember, the definition for biohazardous waste is very subjective. And I think that unless an item is completely saturated or soaked with human body fluids or blood, they can just be placed in the regular trash. This includes gowns and drapes. Splints, even if bloodied from an open fracture, can just be thrown in the regular trash. And then even dressings or gauze, again, as long as they're not completely saturated, can just be thrown in the regular trash and avoid the incineration that leads to greenhouse gas production. We could even consider re-implementation of recycling bins in the operating room. I know that during the course of our residency, there's been intermittent and inconsistent use of these recycling containers. And this is something that we could make a concerted effort to reinstate that's both cheap and pretty easy to do. However, we'd have to be careful because the same type of self-regulation in terms of sorting our waste would be required as is required with the red bag waste. Now we know that liquid waste is unavoidable in the operating room, but this is actually an area that we're doing pretty well. So focus on the use of these closed suction systems like a Neptune, as opposed to a generic vacuum container, allows for not only reduced exposure, but these closed suction systems actually allow for individuals to directly empty the contents of the liquid waste into the hospital's fluid waste management system. So it avoids that conversion to a solid waste, then incineration as red bag waste. On the other hand, we still have pretty significant work when it comes to sterile processing of our instruments. We know from one of the life cycle analyses that we discussed at the beginning that we're so wasteful with our current sets, use of disposable instrumentation is currently advantageous from an environmental standpoint. So this naturally calls for some streamlining of our trays and sets in an attempt to mitigate some of the OR overage that we're responsible for. And that's exactly what this recent study published in the Journal of Arthroplasty sought to prove. By reducing the overall instrumentation for a primary total hip arthroplasty from 10 sets to 2, and having the number of instruments from 163 that came in the standard sets to just 82 instruments, this group found that there was an energy savings of 7 kilowatts per case. There was a decreased total mass of solid waste produced by 1.6 kilograms, or just over 3 pounds. And it also saved an average of $400 per case, which again is important when trying to make these changes. You have a financial incentive that can get administrators on board. So when we consider the predicted increase in arthroplasty in the US with that chart we showed earlier, I think that this streamlining of sets can and will make a considerable difference in the long run. And so while this type of streamlining is particularly relevant or easier to implement with arthroplasty, given that there's a limited number of procedures and a high volume of surgical cases, the sentiment of reducing waste generated by our sterile instrument sets can be applied across specialties. The goal is to go from the instrument set and waste produced in the top row to that seen in the bottom row. And I think this is a realistic thing that can be done in our healthcare system. And we've already seen some progress with this, again, at our county hospital. So with the introduction of the heat rooms, or the high efficiency arthroplasty rooms that have been implemented in an attempt to increase the total joint volume at SFGH, we've actually been able to streamline our sets, again, to about two sets total from the typical 10 needed for an arthroplasty. And while the residents know that these rooms are still far from efficient, this is at least one thing we've done that's a step in the right direction regarding the environmental impact that we have. I also think that this is something that larger academic centers could potentially learn from smaller practices, private practices, or community surgeons. So we all recognize that there's a push to move medicine, and in particular, orthopedics, to the outpatient setting. Doing cases at ASCs is becoming the norm across the country. And while the motives for this, again, are obviously financially driven for the most part, we know that cases done at surgery centers use less equipment and materials, and that, again, has a secondary benefit on our carbon footprint for any given procedure. I'm sure most residents would agree that doing a knee scope at the OI is more efficient, uses less equipment, and fewer sets are ultimately opened than when we do the same case either at Parnassus or Mount Zion. And not all solutions to waste generation have to occur intraoperatively. Perioperative decision-making and purchasing power specifically can have a pretty significant impact on the environmental consequences of our operating rooms and procedures. Medical textiles, and more specifically gowns, are a prime target of study because they're both ubiquitous and necessary for all of our cases. The debate for reusable versus single-use gowns has even been studied using an LCA with a strong favor towards these reusable gowns. The reusable gowns were found to use 64% less energy than that of the disposable gowns. There was 66% decreased CO2 emissions during the production of these gowns. And unsurprisingly, 84% less trash was generated with the use of these cloth gowns. But what really surprised me and I found interesting in this study was there was actually an overall decrease in water consumption with the production of these reusable gowns when considering the entire life cycle as a whole. So you think, well, with these gowns, you have to wash them and do the laundry to turn them over. But there's actually something inherently water wasteful in the production of the disposable gowns that really overrides the need for laundry of the cloth gowns. And that's important because a recent study done here at UCSF in the Department of Surgery looking at the perioperative perceptions of these reusable cloth gowns highlighted two major barriers to their implementation here at UCSF. The first was a questionable understanding about the environmental impact or benefit that these cloth gowns have. And there was also a specific worry, again, about the water consumption that is required for the reusable gowns, specifically in California, which, as we know, is in a terrible drought. So I wanted to go through a couple of quotes from this study to highlight some salient points. This is from respondent 24. I have no idea which is more environmentally friendly. To me, this is a data-free zone, though my guess is there is data. I just don't know what it is. Happy to do whatever is safe, but also makes sense for our world. Another quote from respondent 36 of the study. Are reusable gowns really that much more environmentally friendly? What about the water to wash them? Detergent? Aren't we in a drought? So again, these quotes show that there's both an interest in change, but a lack of awareness, or at least a lack of education that prevents any meaningful change in our decision-making or practices. It also highlights just how powerful these nuanced data from the LCAs that we've talked about can be regarding educating all those involved in the perioperative decision-making process to actually enact a proposed change in practice. So now let's talk about single-use devices. So we know from our prior discussion of the LCA at the beginning of the talk that our environmental footprint in orthopedics is so large that currently these single-use devices, again, are more advantageous from an environmental standpoint. But that doesn't mean it's the right thing to do going forward. We also have to acknowledge that disposable equipment and implants generate a significant amount of the absolute volume of trash that we generate. and that a single-use designation doesn't just apply to surgical instruments or implants, but also refers to equipment used in the operating room as a whole, such as SCDs, BP cuffs, and tourniquets. I'd also like to point out that the designation of single-use comes from the manufacturer itself, not from the FDA, which I think we can all agree represents an absolutely massive conflict of interest when selling and using these products. However, what we do know is that the use of these single-use devices, the reuse of these single-use devices is both safe and effective. That same hospital in Washington that we mentioned earlier was also able to save nearly $500,000 annually and prevented 6 tons of solid waste from heading to the landfill by reprocessing over 100 different types of single-use devices across surgical subspecialties. These were both intraoperative instruments and implants, as well as operating room equipment like the BP cuffs, SCDs, and tourniquets that we discussed. So this concept of reuse has proven to be so financially effective that it led to the recent development of reprocessing companies that take these discarded single-use devices from hospital systems, refurbish them, and then resell them for a discounted price. Again, the motivation here is clearly financial, but the secondary environmental impact can't be ignored. And again, it's at least a step in the right direction for minimizing our footprint of waste in the operating room. It also doesn't hurt that orthopedics potentially stands to gain the most from the reprocessing in terms of our overall cost savings. That study found that orthopedics alone saved almost $50,000 annually just by reprocessing some of our single-use devices. So again, when we're trying to propose these changes, this kind of information helps because it kind of greases the wheels to make things actually happen. And I don't think we can finish up a talk in the Bay Area without at least briefly mentioning the impact that technology can have in greening up our orthopedic practice. So perioperative care is essential to surgical care. One change that's occurred as a result of the COVID pandemic was the Zoom revolution. Both patients and practitioners alike now have an incredible Zoom literacy that is essentially ubiquitous and spans geographic regions. There's also been significant buy-in from practitioners and physicians alike to keep these Zoom meetings or visits as at least a portion of their practice as we've entered into the post-pandemic era. This undoubtedly has potential to positively impact our patient care footprint in both the immediate pre as well as post-operative periods. There was even a recent LCA published on this out of Yale that evaluated the carbon footprint before and after implementation of a perioperative telehealth visit prior to elective spine surgery. In the study, they evaluated the immediate preoperative period, including the testing, the clinic visits, and the waste associated with those clinic visits, as well as the estimated patient commuting on average for each patient that came in for what was deemed an unnecessary or not required in-person visit. What they found was there was an average of 10% reduction per person in terms of CO2 equivalents after the introduction of telehealth appointments to take the place of only unnecessary in-person visits preoperatively. So let's talk about avenues for improvement and review some of the things that we've discussed. First, let's consider implementation of an OR setback schedule, or at least at a minimum, turning off the lights and equipment in the OR when not in use overnight. I know that there's already some discussion of this at the Mission Bay campus, but I don't believe it's actually been enacted yet. Next, let's just take the few extra steps to sort our biohazardous trash appropriately. Even if it goes to the landfill, that's still better than going to the incinerator. Next, we can consider streamlining our sets with only essential instrumentation to save on the energy and costly reprocessing of our instrumentation. And I know that we do this at some of our sites, but let's try to make it standard practice to reuse single-use devices as often as possible. Again, we can start with blood pressure cuffs, SCDs, tourniquets, before we actually move on to intraoperative devices. And finally, I know this is easy for us to do here, but I would encourage everyone as they move out into their practices, especially the residents, to try and keep Zoom or telehealth visits as at least a portion of their practice when appropriate to save. And then I also wanted to take a moment to celebrate some of the recent successes. Unsurprisingly, UCSF is at the leading edge of both monitoring and trying to minimize the impact that healthcare has on the environment as a whole. You can see from the graph here that UCSF has been tracking the energy use that it produces, or that it uses, for over a decade, and is overall on track with its long-term goal in energy reduction. You can see the little blip there between 2013 and 15, and that's likely due to the construction and opening of the Mission Bay campus, but we quickly rebounded and got right back on track. We're also right on track with our solid waste generation or minimization goals. As you can see, we're already nearly at our 2025 goal of waste minimization, which I would like to point out still stands at a whopping 25 pounds per person per day in the hospital. You can see at the bottom of each of these graphs that the largest component remains the municipal or just standard trash, but hazardous waste, which is the light blue bar just above it, is a close second, and as we discussed, could be a major avenue for improvement if we just do a better job sorting it. And then while we're on track, we can always do better and strive to minimize our waste. And then talking about future directions, I wanted to shout out to our own department for taking on this very challenging topic. So Drs. Woolley and Lansdowne, along with the help of Dr. Seema Gandhi from the anesthesia department, are currently spearheading an effort to do a true prospective LCA for outpatient total shoulder arthroplasty. The goal of this study, which starts by first observing and recording all the materials and trash generated in all phases of a total shoulder arthroplasty, is set to determine what component of that procedure generates the most trash. And so the time frame for this study is set to begin at pre-op and continues through the hospitalization of our short stay patients. And again, we're looking at what portion of waste or how much of the waste comes from the overnight stay portion of these cases. We know, much like hips and knees, the rate of total shoulder arthroplasty is increasing as our patients age and live longer while also wanting to remain more active. We know that total shoulders can be done outpatient when you pick the right patient, but we haven't made a lot of traction at UCSF from shifting to this outpatient model. People typically stay overnight because it's the way things have been done. But I would say for most of our patients that undergo a total shoulder, they spend the night, not a lot happens overnight. They go home the next morning, we don't check labs, and that's just the way we've done it. We typically send rotator cuff patients home the same day, which can often be the same age demographic or similar, and typically have more pain than post-op total shoulders, and we don't hesitate with doing so. So a goal, again, is to observe what kind of reduction we could have from an environmental standpoint by shifting these cases from Mount Zion to the OI. And again, only when appropriate. And as you can see, the process map for this proposed study looks very similar and just as nuanced and complex as the one we showed at the beginning of the talk. So again, I just wanted to highlight how time intensive these projects are, and good job to Drs. Woolley and Lansdowne for helping spearhead this. This project also directly aligns with UCSF's sustainability goals under the leadership of Dr. Gandhi, who's helping with the project, and the UCSF's perioperative sustainability committee. I also wanted to highlight that there's some opportunities offered by this office, and there are some grants that are provided to both students and trainees to carry out projects that are aimed at helping with UCSF's carbon neutrality goals as a whole. So if any residents or students out there have a project in mind, this is a great opportunity to get both funding and mentorship from those on the sustainability committee. So in conclusion, we know that our current path is unsustainable. We also know that LCAs are the gold standard for evaluating our impact in the environment and are also very underrepresented in orthopedics. But hopefully this is changing thanks to Dr. Lansdowne and Woolley. Finally, I'd like to reiterate that small, even small but consistent changes in our behavior can, and I think will, make a considerable impact in minimizing our carbon footprint as we move forward as a specialty. So with that, I'd like to thank everyone for their attention. We can move on to any questions. And sorry, one last thing, Dan's out, so here's the QR code if you want credit.